Good morning, church. When I was a young boy, my father would take my siblings and I to cemeteries. Now, I was living in Kansas at the time, which is where my father's family has its roots. And I've seen the graves of many ancestors, people I've never met because they died over a century ago. And since then, and to this day, I have been interested in history and genealogy, and these trips help to inspire that in me. But I'll be honest, going to the graveyard really freaked me out. See, I had an overly active imagination, and I would share some of the irrational fears that I had, but I know that my young son, who also has an overly active imagination, is listening to this at home right now. I will just tell you that cemeteries gave me the heebie-jeebies. But still, I was intrigued by people who were important to me, because if it weren't for them, and if they hadn't had children, and who had children who had children who had me, I wouldn't exist. And yet, while I understand their importance, it's still difficult for me to see them as more than a name. And I know that Manoah Miles was my great-great-great-grandfather, and that he was the one who moved the family from Kansas, from Missouri, after he retired around 1880. But I have no idea what he looked like, what he did for a living, or even what kind of person he was. It's just a name to me. It's a cool name, and I considered naming my son Manoah, but my wife vetoed it. And we named him after Manoah's son John instead. There are large portions of the Bible that are easy for us to dismiss, because it's all just names and family trees about how so-and-so married that woman and their sons were this and that. And that son married this person and their children had these names, and so on and so forth. And I would like to consider it interesting, but quite frankly, it is boring. And I say that most of us we skip past those parts of the Bible because, hey, what does this matter to us as Christians living in the 21st century? Why is it important for us to know who fathered who, and who, when I can't even pronounce their names? And so when reading the entire Bible, most of us skip past sections like the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, which tell us all about the history and genealogy of Israel, starting with Adam and his sons and their sons, all the way through the 12 sons of Jacob, and then all of their sons and their sons. And I'll tell you this, church, it's okay to skip past them, because there isn't much theological significance for us living today. And to us, they are just names. But I want to make something clear. That just because it's not important to us does not mean that it was not important to someone. And for the people that these genealogies were written to thousands of years ago, these names mean a lot. Now, to use the example, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these were books written to an Israel that was coming out of exile. And it had been 2 or 3 generations since they as a people had been free and able to live in their homeland. After living in Babylon for 70 years, they were coming back to a place that they did not know. It would be as if my children were to move not just to Kansas, but back to the Philippines, where my mother's family's from. They know the significance of it. They know that their ancestors lived there. They know that the food is amazing, but they would have no idea how to live in the Philippines themselves. And so the author of Chronicles seeks to bridge a connection between the ancient and modern. he seeks to remind the people who they are and who they come from. And more importantly, he seeks to emphasize that they are God's people, heirs of the covenant that God gave to Abraham so long ago. And he says, let me prove it, folks, by showing you that this genealogy that shows exactly how you and you and you are descended from these people in Scripture all the way back to Adam himself. He'll say, what was your grandfather's name? Great. Well, here's proof that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. Therefore, you and your family are of the tribe of Benjamin. See, to us today, these are just names of people who lived thousands of years ago. And to the original audience, they were just names too. They didn't know who Amzi or Eliab or Izar were either. But they were significant and important to them because these were their connections to the past that was under the threat of being forgotten. And if we were to completely skip through this, we would lose on some interesting details. It's not all boring, I'll tell you that. And through this list of names, there are some details given to us about their lives. And some are famous. They need no further mentions, like Aaron or Joshua or David. We know all about them. But others, the author of Chronicles gives us a few lines of background. And it's on one of these particular people that I want to talk about today. Because among this long list of names, the author of Chronicles pauses and takes some time to talk about a man named Jabez. Jabez is one of the extras in the Bible, someone in the background that just makes a quick cameo appearance. And we're going to be looking at a few of these extras over the next few weeks. We find Jabez's story in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. We read this. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother had named him Jabez, saying, I gave birth to him in pain. And Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. It seems strange to me that the chronicler would stop to make this side note. Because who was Jabez anyway? I mean, this is all that we know of him. 2 verses. We know that he made a request to God and that God answered it. And we just have 2 verses, and you might wonder how I'm going to make a whole sermon out of it. But I actually had to cut some content to keep this from going long, so buckle in. I want to pause first, though, because if you're familiar with Jabez already, it's likely because a little over 20 years ago, an author by the name of Bruce Wilkinson wrote a book entitled The Prayer of Jabez. I have not read it. I can't say much about it. I will say I have not heard good things about it from those who have, but I haven't informed myself. Maybe you have. But that being said, who was this guy? Who was Jabez? Well, from the handy genealogy that this is set within, we know that he is descended from the tribe of Judah. And judging from the names that came before and after him, we can discern that he lived around the time of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. And his family was not particularly distinguished like others in his tribe, being listed in a category of other families in the tribe of Judah. He was not listed among the influential or the wealthy. But Jabez found a way to distinguish himself from the others. And we read that he was more honorable than his brothers, which is noteworthy and a little ironic when we consider his name. Now, the verse reads that his mother named him Jabez because he was born with pain, born in pain. And what we have in Jabez in English is in Hebrew pronounced more like Jabez or Jabez. I'm going to keep calling him Jabez. But if you switch a couple of Hebrew letters around, you very closely have the Hebrew word used to describe anguish, intense sorrow, or pain. Apparently, either his birth was particularly hard or unbearable, or perhaps it could be that Jabez was born into a distressful or sorrowful time in his family's life. We could only speculate. But regardless, he was born into horrible circumstances. And his name was a constant reminder of that. And in a culture where names were very important, it would have been hard to rise above it. I mean, even today, it would be difficult if you're applying to a job and your first name was Payne. It's like, oh, that's kind of weird. But nevertheless, his name and his birth did not define him. Instead, the first thing we read about him is that he was more honorable than his brothers. Now, again, the Hebrew word behind this is the word kabad, which literally means heavy. Jabez was heavier than his brothers. Now, it could be that Jabez was just a big guy, and that's what the chronicler is trying to say. And while that could be true, it makes more sense to see the extra meaning behind that word. And in English, very similarly, we have a concept when we say that something is weighty. And when describing a person, it conveys the idea of importance, that they were impressive or noteworthy. And that's exactly what's happening here. Jabez possesses an importance that makes him stand out. And so in this first sentence, we learn two things about this man. First, that he was a man of importance and high reputation, and that he was born into pain. And it's a point of contrast that is more evident in the Hebrew than in English, where the words are used to reflect the irony of the statement. It's like saying that Jabez was a great man, but he wasn't always that way. For example, we might say Abraham Lincoln was a great American president, but he was born in a log cabin. There was a great change in his life. And the next verse offers an explanation as to how Jabez went from such a lowly status to such influential greatness in his later years. And in verse 10, we read that he prayed to God. Now, in the next several minutes, I want to break down this prayer because we see four distinct requests that Jabez is making. This verse is packed with significance that we can easily miss if we just simply take it at first value. So take a look at 1 Chronicles 4:10. First, Jabez asks the Lord to bless him. And this is no small, ordinary request, but one that reflects the deep and powerful emotions behind the word. Because when looking at that original language, there is a rare expression being used that is not found in many places, which scholars call a particle of wishing. The particular words used reveal a man that desperately wants something with all of his heart. And this makes a difference, as it's not just Jabez asking God, hey, could you bless me? Because that'd be pretty cool if you did. No. This is more of a prayer of the heart, crying out to God, oh, sovereign Lord, please bless me. Now, asking for God's blessing was not a little thing either. This was the blessing that all Hebrews longed for, the blessing of God's covenant, the blessing shown to Abraham. And we read that God blessed Abraham, that his blessing was handed down through the generations, where he said, I will be your God, and you will be my people, says the Lord. In that same way, Jabez is asking God to bless him. And in effect, he is asking for a change in his life. That God would break through the cloud of pain and suffering and anguish that has surrounded his life thus far. Make my future different by granting me a larger share in the blessing that you have given your people, O Lord. And that last part is clearer in the next part of this verse, because here he asks God to enlarge his borders. That seems a little straightforward. Jabez is praying for more stuff, right? I want a bigger backyard. But if we leave it at that, this causes us some problems. Because Jabez might seem materialistic, even a little selfish. Who's he taking this yard from? But isn't this the kind of prayer that we are warned against? How is this different than praying that God give us a brand new Mercedes? Now, there have been people who have used this story even to justify the name it and claim it prosperity gospel message. It says, if you ask God for anything, he will give it to you. But we know the dangers of this kind of teaching. God is not a genie granting wishes. But here it's clear that God answered Jabez's prayer. Why? Well, like I said, there's more to this prayer than meets the eyes. And this is more than Jabez's wish list. Make no mistake, this was an ambitious prayer. Jabez was asking for more land, which would have come with it greater wealth, higher standing in the community, and more power even. We can't argue that Jabez wasn't praying to be made rich and powerful. There's no way around that. He was. But there isn't anything particularly wrong with that. I mean, ambition is not a bad thing. However, with ambition, motives matter. Praying to become rich for the sake of being rich is not what the Lord desires. And I would have a hard time believing that God would answer such a prayer. But becoming rich is not what Jabez was after. See, in the context of Hebrew culture, Israel was associated with responsibility and having a greater stake in God's covenant. And so Jabez was asking that God would give him a bigger role in God's plan for Israel. With that would come greater responsibility, which would come with it blessings, but also the stress and the difficulties and the headaches of being in such a position of power. It was an honorable ambition, and God saw it for what it was. But Jabez's prayer doesn't end there. He continues, asking that the Lord's hand be with him. Now, the hand of the Lord is mentioned numerous times throughout the Bible, and it represents God's power, strength, and control. When God demonstrated his power in the Bible, it is often said to be the hand of the Lord. And in praying this, Jabez was asking God to answer this prayer in a way that glorifies God. He's asking that God would be with him, especially with the blessings of power and responsibility, and that as Jabez grew more and more successful, that he would not grow farther away from God, but that God would be with him all the time. He's asking that God continually guide him. May Jabez never forget that he did not achieve success merely on his own and with his own hands, but that it came to him through God's hand and God's blessing. And we see this pattern throughout the Scriptures, that those that God blesses are those that seek God's glory and live in humble submission to God. The last part of the prayer is a call for protection. Literally, he's asking that God would keep him free from pain. It's a prayer that everyone prays, that God would protect us. But for Jabez, this was personal. He used the very word that his mother had in mind when she named him. Jabez knew pain. He knew suffering. And so he isn't just asking that God guard him from future harm. He's asking to be freed from the sorrow and pain that characterized his life. He's asking God, help me to not live up to my name, because I've seen enough of it, and I can't take much more. So here's a guy who's only known bad things in his life, a nobody that didn't have much going for him, and he's asking God for change. He's asking that for once, that he would be a somebody, asking not from a heart of greed or selfishness, but from a heart that genuinely loves God. And he asks that God would bless him in the way that only God could. And throughout it all, that God would be with him always. And most of all, he's praying that God would turn his life around so that it wouldn't hurt so much. Because as it was just too hard. The result, as we read, is that God answered his request. Other translations, God brought about what he requested, or God made it come to pass. But as with the rest of this passage, it's not as simple as that, because it's not like God just waved his hand and bam, it happened. Instead, this word implies something that happened gradually. Literally, we read that God made it come to pass. Now, when God answers prayers, it is very seldom instant or immediate or even as quick as we would like it to be. Prayers require patience. God granted Jabez's request, but it certainly wasn't overnight, but most likely occurred over the rest of his life. And this is something that many of us struggle with as we live in a world of instant gratification, where if we want something, we get it right away. But when we pray, we have to realize that God works on God's time and on God's schedules. And we simply have to trust that God will do it. Jabez was a man who took a bold step of faith, and God honored it. He didn't just give, but God was there with him every step of the way, developing his faith, protecting him from harm, and in the end, he gave him everything he asked for. And that is how our God works. He is a God of mercy and grace and love. And God does listen to you. And God will bless you. He is the God that makes somebodies out of nobodies. And in God's eternal kingdom of heaven, we are all blessed. And this is the gospel we are preaching. And the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. May the world hear it and know the God to whom we are bearing witness, and in all things. May God receive all glory and honor and praise.